Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial we're going to create a bitmap class. I've made a couple of little tiny changes to the last program. I renamed this the file containing the main function, so you can do that just by right clicking it, going to rename here and typing a new name. And after you do that, you probably want to make sure that your project still builds and still runs, just in case. I've also gone to my header files and I've added a namespace cave of programming around the structs for the bitmap file header and bitmap info header, so they're both in a namespace now. And I've made sure they're included in the main program and that I can still build that and it still runs. So that shouldn't cause you any problems, but I think it's really good to check that you've still got a working program after you make any significant change like this. Okay, so if we think about what objects are going to be in our program, this is going to be a program that writes a fractal image to a bitmap. So we're probably going to want to have a fractal class, and we're going to want to have a bitmap class, and we want to make these as self-contained as possible, not only so that we could potentially reuse them in other programs that do something perhaps completely different or quite different, but also because making them the classes encapsulated and self-contained helps to keep this program easy to understand and easy to maintain and debug. So I'm going to right click my project here and go to new class, and let's call this bitmap. And I'm going to put this in a cave of programming namespace. So I've ticked this and it's filled in this just because I've used it before already. That's going to generate bitmap.h and bitmap.cpp and give us a constructor and destructor. Now, when I create the bitmap, I'm going to want to say how big it is. So I'm going to, in the constructor, I want to have constructor parameters here, int width and int height. And we're going to use those to set a couple of private instance variables so we can refer to them later. Let's call them int m_width. That's for member variable width, m_ there. Some people just put, it's quite common just to see instance variables with underscores on the front, but that always used to really confuse me, so I still don't like doing it. I'd rather see an m there. And let's say int m_height. Then we can set those in the constructor initialization list. Since this is C++11, I can actually initialize them here to 0, which I'll do because it could help us not introduce any bugs if we add other constructors later or whatever. So since I have the opportunity to initialize them in C++11, I will do. And after this initialization runs, this is the first thing that's going to initialize these variables. Then later the constructor will run and we can set them to width and height there, the values that we're actually going to pass in when we create our bitmap object. So if I go to the CPP file, here in the constructor initialization list, once I've added int width and int height here, I can type a colon and then we can say m_width is initialized with width, and comma, and m_height is initialized with height. I'm going to add a couple more methods as well. We're probably not going to use the destructor actually, unless you're, possibly if you're using an earlier version of C++, but I'm planning to do this using smart pointers, so we probably won't use the destructor, but I'll leave it. It's not really doing any harm there. So let's add a couple more methods. I'm going to have one method which is going to return a bool. I'm going to call it write, and it's going to take a string file name. And this, the idea is you create your bitmap, you set pixels in it, and then at the end you write it using this method and specifying the file name to write to. So for string there, let's include at the top, include string, and we need to say using name space standard, and we need to fill in the the body of this method, the reason I made it return a bool is because writing to files is such a potentially error-prone thing. You might not have permission to write the file or whatever on your disk. So I'm going to make it return false if it doesn't succeed and true if it does. We could also raise an exception there, kind of Java style, but I prefer to only use exceptions for things that really have gone terribly wrong in the program rather than things that could easily happen as a matter of routine. So let's go to bitmap.cpp, paste that in, add the brackets, and we need to say that it's a member of the bitmap class. And for the moment, I'm just going to return false, let's say, or true, just to have a stub there, so we can fill in this possibly in the next tutorial or the one after that or something. Just check that it still works, still builds, it still runs. And the other method that I want to have in there is going to be a set pixel method. This one I'm going to make return void. I'm going to call it set pixel. So this will allow us to set pixels in the bitmap to specified colors. So we need to say the width and the height. Actually, not really width and height, but let's maybe better say row and column, or column and row. Yeah, maybe say, now I'm dithering because using row and column is a bit confusing. We've got to say where to set the pixel at, but if you say row, I don't know why, somehow, maybe because you always say first row and then column, it sounds like that's going to be the width and the height, so the position to set the pixel at. But the row, of course, is actually there, corresponds to the height, because the rows increase as you go down the screen. Let's call it X and Y. It's the perfect compromise now that I think of it. For the colours, we want to specify a RGB triplet, in other words, a red value, green value and blue value. And those are each going to be unsigned bytes, which can go up to a maximum of 255, so 0 to 255. I could use an unsigned char for those types, but let's include C standard int. And we're using the standard namespace already, and then I can use the type uint8 underscore t. So that's basically it's an unsigned 8-bit int, or in other words, an unsigned char, which is what we want. And again, as I said previously, if you don't have this on your with your compiler, you just need to Google for your compiler and 8-bit unsigned type to find out what you use there, but this is pretty standard. Let's say red and uint8 underscore t green, it's green value, uint8 underscore t blue. And finally, we can just fill in a stub for this method, and that's all I'm going to do for the moment for this tutorial. We'll come back and fill in these methods later. So it's a member of bitmap, and we just need the brackets there, and it doesn't return anything. So if we do that, it should all compile, and it should all be fine. We've got a warning here, and that's just telling us that width and height is not used, which is fine for the moment. The warnings don't stop it compiling. It's the errors that you really have to pay close attention to. And of course, you don't want warnings, if possible, in your final program, but for the moment it's good. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. Until next time, happy coding.